So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our debate on the European Union referendum, and it's good to see so many of you here this evening. My name is Julian Critchlow, and as you can see, I'm your chairman for the evening. And we're very lucky to have a panel of 4 distinguished speakers, all of whom are prominent in the referendum debate and incredibly knowledgeable about the issues. However, and I think this is very important for the debate, they come from diverse parts of the political spectrum. We have Independent, Social Democrat, UKIP, Labour and Conservative. So let me introduce them. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. 2005 general election as Conservative MP for Harwich and was elected for Clacton in 2010. In 2014 he declared for UKIP, won the by-election that he triggered and was re-elected last year, currently being UKIP's 1 MP. In 2014, in recognition of his efforts to bring change to Westminster, The Spectator named him Insurgent of the Year. So we'll start then with our first speaker, who is Douglas Carswell.
Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me along to be a part of the evening's entertainment, so to speak. It was sold to us as an economic proposition when we joined what was to become the European Union, the common market, all those years ago. They said, yes, it might lead to a bit of a loss of self-government, fuddy-duddy ideas like sovereignty. We might lose a bit of self-government, but look, we'd become more prosperous. We'd grow richer. Just look across the channel now. Who seriously believes that anymore? Being part of the EU makes us less prosperous and gives us less self-government. It's not just the crisis in the Eurozone I'm talking about, although I note that that has somewhat dented the credibility of those who said we would face ruin unless we joined the Euro all those years ago. It's far more fundamental than that. The EU is a pretty disastrous way to organise the affairs of an entire continent. A disastrous way, particularly economically. And the European Union is not working economically. Remember what the world was like at the beginning of the financial crisis back in 2008. Remember perhaps what you were doing back then. Gordon Brown was our Prime Minister. There were queues forming outside Northern Rock. Well, since then, since the beginning of the financial crisis, the economy of China has grown by 400%. The economy of India has doubled. Even Brazil, which is held up as an example of how not to do it, even Brazil's economy has grown by 40%. But in the EU, the only indices that have grown by that amount are those that measure debt, unemployment, and particularly youth unemployment. Now, you might say, hang on, that's not fair. You're not comparing like with like. You should compare us to other advanced economies around the world. Okay, well, let's compare how countries inside the single market have performed against countries like Canada, Switzerland, New Zealand. Since 1992, the advent of the single market, those economies have grown much faster than the single market. In fact, the per capita GDP of those countries has grown almost 50% faster than those inside the single market. Over the past 20 years or so, we've seen the emergence of companies that simply didn't exist a couple of decades ago. We see companies coming along like Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, even Alibaba in China. Many of these companies have grown much faster than many of the old industrial firms. They are to the new economy what Volkswagen, Ford, Audi were to the old economy. But do you notice something? None of these companies comes from inside the European Union. Where are the European Union's Facebooks, Amazons, Apples? The European Union used to look like it was the future, but not anymore. It's failing. And it's failing for a fundamental reason, and that's because those who take the decisions aren't accountable to those affected by the decisions. Public policy is made by people who don't answer to the public. I can give you specific examples where the European Union has stifled innovation. Take, for example, the issue of clinical trials. Britain used to lead the world in clinical trials. 12% of all clinical trials that happened on the planet used to happen in the late 1990s in this country. That's an enormous amount of work on life-saving treatments to fight cancer, MS. Then along came the EU's Clinical Trials Directive, drawn up by officials and bureaucrats who simply didn't understand and don't understand science. They don't understand that often scientific experiment means you don't know what the outcome of that experiment is going to be, yet they imposed the so-called precautionary principle. The EU Clinical Trials Directive doubled the cost of clinical trials, meaning that today, little more than 1% of all clinical trials in the world happens in this country. The EU is making the whole of Europe less innovative. We can look at this in some empirical data. For decades, if not centuries, Europe has led the way in terms of scientific innovation, but we now see that there are more non-EU patents now filed in the EU than EU patents. By objective empirical criteria, the European Union is making Europe less inventive and innovative. It's a similar story of wrong-headed rulemaking, not just in science, but in the city, in financial services, in the insurance sector, in aquaculture. Small businesses have been hit by rules on VAT drafted by people who've never done business. Now, the EU isn't working economically because it's failing democratically. It's run in the interests of vested interests. Look at its currency, the euro. It's kept alive by sacrificing the prosperity of tens of millions of ordinary Europeans in Italy, in Greece, in Spain. The European Union means being governed by a commission that is unelected. Now, at this point, someone usually points out, hang on a second, the European Commission might be unelected, but what about the European Parliament? Okay, what about the European Parliament? In the 2010 to 2014 session, the European Parliament voted on approximately 1,900 motions. On nearly 800 occasions, most British MEPs opposed what was being decided. And yet, in nearly 700 occasions, it went ahead anyway. That's not democratic. The European Parliament gives us a minority share in a peripheral, marginal institution. It is no antidote to the fundamentally anti-democratic nature of the EU. Now, many people like to think of themselves as internationalist, and it's a good thing to be internationalist. Internationalism is great. It's good that we cooperate with people from other cultures and continents and countries. But the European Union, Brussels, is not a seat of high-minded internationalism. It is the capital of cartel corporatism. There are more lobbyists per head in Brussels than even in Washington, D.C. It is because Brussels is home to many vested interests that big corporate, powerful vested interests often like the EU. They often want us to remain in the EU. Now, it's not true that business in this country wants us to remain in the EU. There are good surveys that have been done to show quite clearly that the majority of businesses find the costs of complying with the single market rules outweigh the benefits. But I think it's fair to say that there are certain big corporate interests who favour Brussels. Why? Perhaps it's something to do with the fact that instead of spending their marketing budgets doing what most businesses have to do, what small and medium-sized businesses have to do, which is to persuade willing customers to buy their products at a price they're willing to pay, being in the European Union allows those big corporate interests to rig the rules so that the customer has to buy what it is that they're selling. Now, I've done a little research before I came here, and I looked at the figures for the first 6 months of 2015. And I looked at what the top 10 companies that have been lobbying the EU institutions spent. In the first 6 months of 2015, the top 10 companies, big pharmaceutical companies, companies like Deutsche Bank, in the first 6 months, they spent 39 million euros lobbying the EU institutions. You can buy a lot of lunches for 39 million euros. You can rig a lot of rules for 39 million euros. I'm not sure it's fair on the rest of us. Just look at some of the people on the other side who are backing the Remain campaign. Peter Mandelson, Goldman Sachs, George Osborne, David Cameron, the Kinnock family. What is it about Brussels and its tax-free salaries that attracts the Kinnock family to the Remain campaign? You know, there are a lot of rich and powerful people on the other side in this referendum. But I think we're going to win, and I'm confident not just because of recent polls that there have been. I think we're going to win for a fundamental reason, and it's this. There is an honest and honourable argument to be made for Britain's membership of the EU. I'm not going to make it myself. I don't agree with it. But it exists. It's honest and it's honourable and it's decent. But we never hear them making it. And that's because I don't think they believe in it. It's the sunken costs argument. They've spent their careers advocating our EU membership long after the rationale for us remaining in the EU has gone. And they don't really believe it. So what do? Instead of reaching for a vision of an improved EU, do you know what they do? They invoke doom and gloom to try to manipulate the voters into doing what they want. At the beginning of this campaign, they suggested that if we dared to become a self-governing country, what's so radical and off-the-wall and extreme about self-government? I don't know. Most countries around the world are self-governing. But nonetheless, they said that if we dared to become a self-governing country, there wouldn't be any more Premiership football, apparently. They said that house prices would go up until they realised that, or down until they realised that perhaps young people didn't like that, and then they said it would go up, or the other way around. I'm surprised they haven't yet invoked a plague of locusts and a shower of meteorites if we become a self-governing democracy. But, you know, I think people across this country are fed up with being patronised by politicians this way. I think people have had enough of being spoken to like 7-year-olds. In fact, I was going to say like 7-year-olds. I wouldn't even talk to my 7-year-old the way George Osborne and co sometimes speak to the voters in this referendum campaign. I think it's clear that the argument on the other side is lacking precisely because it's so weak. There's nothing extreme or radical about being a self-governing democracy. Let's vote leave on June the 23rd, not simply to free ourselves from those corporate interests in Brussels, but to show that we're fed up of being patronised by a political elite in Westminster who think that they can speak to us and manipulate us like that. It's wrong. Thank you.